It begins with silence, not the peaceful kind that drifts across a field on a summer night, but the suffocating, heavy silence that follows when something terrible has taken place. In the fall of 1837, a rural community in Ohio woke to such silence. The Henderson Orphanage, a looming brick building that stood at the edge of a forest clearing, was discovered utterly empty. The staff had vanished, their beds left untouched, their belongings still in place, but most haunting of all, 42 children. The orphans who called this building their reluctant home were gone. No footprints leading into the woods, no signs of a struggle, just absence, as if the building itself had swallowed them whole. If you love dark, forgotten history, consider subscribing. Here, we explore the shadows of stories America wished to bury. And before we continue, leave a comment with your location and the exact time you're watching this video, because the place you sit and the hour you watch may not be as far removed from this tale as you believe. The story of the Henderson Orphanage does not begin with its vanishing, but that is where history remembers it best. Locals who stumbled upon the silent building described the scene with hushed fear. Beds neatly made, children's shoes lined up by the doors, half-eaten bowls of porridge still cooling on the dining tables. Lamps burned low in the halls, as though someone had expected to return within moments. But no one ever did. For the rest of the town, the building was no longer an institution for the forgotten. It became a monument to disappearance itself. Ohio, in 1837, was still a frontier of sorts. The panic of 1837 had swept across the nation, crippling families, leaving many destitute. Orphanages were a grim necessity, places where unwanted children, those born out of wedlock, abandoned after deaths of parents, or discarded by families too poor to feed them, were gathered, cataloged, and contained. Henderson Orphanage had been considered one of the better ones. Built with red brick walls and iron railings, it stood taller than any structure for miles. Its benefactors boasted of clean dormitories, a chapel for daily prayers, and orderly classrooms. But those who lived closer to its walls spoke of something different, strange lights flickering at night, cries that seemed to echo long after dusk, and a constant unease that clung to the grounds. On the last evening, the children were seen, October 17th. Neighbors recalled a biting chill settling over the town earlier than usual. The orphanage was lit from within, every window glowing as if a great gathering was underway. Some swore they heard music, a faint hymn, though discordant, as if sung in a language that wasn't quite familiar. Others dismissed it as the wind carrying sound strangely. By midnight, the lights went dark. The forest grew quiet again. When morning broke, a milkman passing by noticed the absence of movement. Normally, children would be seen through the windows by sunrise, lining up for their meager breakfast. This time, nothing. He knocked on the door, but it swung inward at his touch. Inside, the building greeted him with the chilling stillness. He stepped into the dining hall first, finding bowls set neatly, spoons placed beside them, porridge hardened overnight, chairs tucked in, not one overturned. No rush, no chaos, just abandonment. The townspeople flooded the grounds within hours. They scoured the forest edge, dragged nearby ponds, and tore through the building from cellar to attic. The orphanage yielded nothing. No bodies, no blood, no footprints, no notes of explanation. It was as though 42 children and several adults had been plucked from existence in one motion. The sheriff, overwhelmed, noted in his ledger only a single sentence: the building is emptied. No cause known. No remains found. Word spread beyond Ohio, whispered along taverns and church aisles, though official newspapers covered it sparingly. America in 1837 was a nation more concerned with its collapsing economy than vanished orphans. Yet those who did write of it could not agree on what had happened. Some suggested the children had been stolen, sold into labor, perhaps by unscrupulous caretakers. Others murmured of disease, that perhaps they had perished and been buried hastily in the woods. But no mass grave was found, and the earth around Henderson was never freshly disturbed. More superstitious locals believed something darker had occurred. A family of farmers living just half a mile from the orphanage testified that, on that final night, they saw figures moving in the fields, dozens of them marching in a line towards the tree line. Each carried a lantern. At the head of the line was a taller silhouette, someone leading them. The family assumed it was an organized event, some form of night prayer or autumn ritual. But when they described the sight days later, after the disappearance, their words chilled listeners. How had dozens of children left the building without leaving a single footprint? Why had the ground revealed nothing? And why, if they had left willingly, had no one ever seen them again? The truth of what happened that night would never be resolved. But in the months and years that followed, the Henderson Orphanage would become a case study in vanishing. A building too silent, too perfect in its untouched state, like a stage set after the actors have gone missing mid-performance. And so begins our descent into its history, its caretakers, and the 42 children who vanished without graves. The Henderson Orphanage was not always a place of dread. In its earliest years, it was celebrated as a testament to progress, a monument to Christian charity rising in the heart of Ohio's countryside. Built in 1829 by a coalition of wealthy benefactors, chief among them, Reverend Silas Greer, and a reclusive businessman named Elias Henderson, the structure was the largest in the county, standing 3 full stories high with a chapel spire that pierced the rural skyline. For townspeople who lived in modest wooden farmhouses, the red brick building looked like a cathedral, a house of God where the unwanted could find shelter. But even as the mortar dried, whispers began. Laborers claimed that during the final days of construction, several men vanished from the worksite without explanation. Tools were found where they had been working: hammers, chisels, saws left as if abandoned in haste. Some workers muttered that Henderson had cut corners, that deaths occurred, and that their bodies had been buried in the foundation to avoid scandal. Others dismissed such talk as superstition, but the orphanage carried those rumors into its birth. Inside, the walls were stark white, lined with long hallways that echoed every footstep. The dormitories were arranged with military precision rows of identical cots, each with a thin blanket folded at the end. The benefactors boasted of order and discipline, of molding the wild orphaned children into industrious citizens. Yet parents who toured the building often left uneasy. Something about the silence disturbed them. The building absorbed sound, a cough, a whisper. Even a laugh, it seemed, swallowed before it reached the air. One local pastor remarked that the place felt less like a sanctuary and more like a mausoleum. The chapel was the centerpiece, stained glass imported from Europe, depicting scenes not commonly found in Methodist churches of the time. Some windows showed not Christ or saints, but abstract patterns of flames, twisting vines and eyes peering outward. When questioned, Reverend Greer claimed the designs were symbolic, a reminder of vigilance, of God's ever-watching presence. But to others, they looked unsettling, as though something besides God was watching. The townspeople noticed something else, too. The building never seemed to decay. While their wooden homes weathered and warped with each Ohio season, the Henderson Orphanage stood unchanged. Bricks remained bright. Mortar never cracked. Some swore that ivy refused to grow on its walls, as if the earth itself rejected it. By 1835, locals began calling it the Silent House, a name that clung even when the children's laughter briefly filled its halls. The benefactors defended the orphanage as a noble project, yet they rarely visited. Elias Henderson, the man whose name it bore, was seen only once at the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Witnesses described him as tall, gaunt, with piercing eyes that gave the impression of a man measuring everything he saw. He made a brief speech, declaring the orphanage a gateway of redemption for lost souls. After that, he disappeared from public life. Rumors spread that he had retreated to a private estate in New England, where he conducted strange studies. Some even claimed he died before the disappearance of 1837, though no records confirmed it. The walls of Henderson Orphanage, meanwhile, gained a reputation among the children themselves. Survivors who had lived there in earlier years before the mass vanishing spoke decades later of strange drafts that blew through hallways even when windows were shut. At night, they heard tapping within the walls, like knuckles knocking, always in sequences of 3. Some claimed that when they pressed an ear against the plaster, they could hear whispers, muffled voices speaking in tones they did not understand. A few even told of shadows that appeared in the dormitories at night, shadows without bodies, stretching long across the floors. The building's reputation worsened in the year leading up to the disappearance. Neighbors reported seeing smoke rise from the chimney at odd hours, sometimes in colors not natural to wood fires, a reddish haze that lingered longer than it should. Farm animals grew skittish near the grounds, refusing to graze on the grass surrounding the walls. Dogs howled if forced near the fence. Farmers swore their cows gave sour milk if driven too close. Yet, despite these warnings, the orphanage remained a proud fixture in the community's landscape. County officials praised its discipline and cleanliness. Visitors from other states came to tour what they thought was a model for future institutions. They saw neat dormitories, tidy gardens, orderly rows of children in uniform. They never saw the locked cellar door beneath the chapel, or the fact that windows in the east wing were nailed shut from the outside. What the walls concealed would never be fully known. But when the children vanished in 1837, those same walls became the focus of suspicion. Were they tombs, concealing graves within their brick? Had the children been hidden inside them? As some whispered, the sheriff ordered parts of the building examined in the weeks after, but no remains were discovered. Some believed the walls themselves had consumed them, swallowing lives as easily as they had swallowed sound. And so the silent walls of Henderson Orphanage remain central to the mystery. They stood before the children disappeared, and they stood after unchanged, unyielding, a hollow monument to the 42 lives that passed through them and never returned. The Henderson Orphanage could not have functioned without its caretakers, the men and women tasked with raising children no one else wanted. On paper, their mission was noble education, spiritual guidance, nourishment. But when investigators tried to trace who these people truly were, after the disappearance, they found a haze of contradictions. The official records named 3 primary staff members, matron Abigail Moore, Reverend Nathaniel Dorr, and a schoolmaster known only as Mr. Cray. There were also 2 young women who served as attendants, remembered by the townsfolk only as the sisters from Cincinnati. Yet, when survivors of earlier years were asked to describe them, the details became unsettlingly vague. Few could recall faces clearly. Some insisted Abigail Moore was a stern woman with silver hair always tied back. Others remembered her as much younger, her hair dark, her posture hunched. Reverend Dorr was said to have a booming voice, though children later claimed he sometimes whispered sermons in the dark, speaking in words not found in the Bible. Abigail Moore, the matron, had once been celebrated for her charity work in neighboring counties. She was widowed, childless, and supposedly driven by faith. Yet, rumors swirled that she had been dismissed from her previous position at a smaller orphanage after several children fell mysteriously ill under her care. No official records confirmed it, and by the time she took charge at Henderson, the matter was forgotten or buried. What is known is that she ruled the children with uncompromising discipline. They rose at dawn, knelt for prayers before eating, and endured cold baths even in winter. Survivors remembered her walking the halls at night with a lantern, pausing at the foot of their beds, watching. She rarely spoke during these inspections, but one boy swore she whispered numbers under her breath as she counted them. Reverend Nathaniel Dorr was less a man of God than a zealot. His sermons to the children were not about hope or compassion, but about damnation, fire, and eternal punishment. "You were abandoned by the world because God wished it so," he once declared, according to testimony later gathered from townspeople who attended the chapel. The sermons grew stranger in the months before the disappearance. One local farmer described hearing him thunder about souls unbound from flesh and children who must walk through the fire to be remade. Some claimed he collected the children's drawings after class, storing them away in locked chests. When the building was searched after the vanishing, none of those drawings were found. The schoolmaster, Mr. Cray, remains the most mysterious. No one ever discovered his first name. Even county ledgers list him only as Cray. He appeared suddenly in 1831, recommended by Reverend Greer as a man of rigorous academic discipline. Yet no one in town could recall where he had come from, or where he lived when not inside the orphanage. Survivors remembered him as tall, thin, and perpetually pale, with hands that shook when he wrote. He rarely punished children, but when he grew angry, his temper was said to be terrifying. Several children described him holding them by the shoulders and staring into their eyes without blinking, until they burst into tears. "It was like he was trying to read something inside me," one orphan recalled decades later. The two young attendants were outsiders, which in 1830s Ohio already made them suspicious. Townspeople knew them only as the sisters, though they were not related by blood. They dressed in plain black, wore no jewelry, and spoke with accents no one could place. Some thought Irish, others thought German. They often walked the grounds at night, carrying candles instead of lanterns, chanting softly to themselves. Several locals swore they saw them etching shapes into the dirt of the orphanage yard circles, lines, and markings that looked like letters but not from any known alphabet. When asked, the women claimed it was part of their teaching games with the children. Perhaps the most chilling discovery came from a diary found years later in an abandoned farmhouse once owned by a town constable. Inside was a single entry about Henderson Orphanage, dated November 1836. "The staff do not match their shadows. I saw Reverend Dorr step across the lamplight, and for a moment his shadow split in two. What makes the caretakers so central to the mystery is not only their behavior, but their vanishing. When the children disappeared, so did they. Their personal belongings were left behind: clothing, books, Reverend Dorr's Bible, but no trace of their bodies was ever found. Neighbors searched for their graves as well, convinced that surely some evidence of violence must remain. Yet the earth gave up nothing. Over time, theories grew darker. Had the caretakers orchestrated the disappearance, leading the children away in the night? Were they part of a broader design, agents of some sect or society that used Henderson Orphanage as its front, or were they themselves victims of something larger, swallowed alongside the children by whatever force dwelled within those walls? Their absence left only questions, and like the walls of Henderson, the shadows of its caretakers remain half-glimpsed, half-remembered, figures that seem to fade the closer you look. If the caretakers of Henderson Orphanage were veiled in secrecy, the children themselves were cloaked in something even more unsettling: absence of identity. 42 names should have been recorded in county ledgers, baptismal registries, or burial lists. Yet, when the researchers searched for them in the years after the disappearance, nearly half seemed to have never existed at all. Many of the children who arrived were the cast-offs of a society collapsing under poverty. The Panic of 1837 had ruined families. and the waves of disease that swept Ohio left countless little ones parentless. Some were delivered to Henderson in the dead of night, left at the gates by strangers who would not give their names. Others were carried in by county officials who themselves had no paperwork, just a child in their arms and a note scribbled with a single first name, sometimes misspelled. What makes Henderson's case eerie is the inconsistency of memory. Older townsfolk recalled certain children clearly Martha, a girl with bright auburn hair who sang hymns so loud she could be heard across the fields; Joseph, a boy with a limp who tended the vegetable garden; little Clara, who once wandered to a nearby farmhouse clutching a doll stitched from rags. These children were real enough, with stories and quirks remembered. But for dozens of others, there were only fragments. One neighbor claimed to have seen a row of children at the chapel windows, yet I could not describe their faces, only the silhouettes. Even more disconcerting were the accounts of children who appeared and then seemed to vanish from memory long before 1837. One farmer's wife swore she brought extra bread loaves to the orphanage one spring and counted over 50 children waiting at the door. Yet, the following week, she counted only around 40. When she asked Abigail Moore, the matron, about the missing number, she was told she must have miscounted. The surviving records are riddled with erasures. Ledgers show first names crossed out and replaced with different ones, as though identities were shuffled. A boy entered as Samuel in March might appear as Elias in June. Girls sometimes had their birth years changed, their ages lowered. It created the unsettling impression of children being dissolved and rewritten, like figures erased from chalk and redrawn at will. And yet, amid this shifting fog, there were testimonies that cut through with clarity. Decades later, a woman named Ruth Billings, who had been adopted from Henderson in 1834 before the disappearance, gave a haunting recollection. She said the children were often asked to practice forgetting. Teachers would line them up and demand they state false names, false birthdays, and repeat them until they could no longer remember the originals. They told us God would give us new souls, Ruth said, but only if we left the old ones behind. She remembered crying at night, unable to recall the sound of her own mother's voice, as though it had been pulled from her. Other adopted children echoed fragments of the same story. They spoke of being woken at midnight for strange lessons, asked to sit in circles, to chant prayers that were not quite prayers. One remembered Reverend Dorr holding a candle and asking each child to name the thing they feared most. He told them the fear would be taken from them, though afterward, some swore they felt emptier, quieter, like something inside had been hollowed out. The orphanage itself reflected this eerie anonymity. Shoes lined up neatly at the door, all the same size, beds arranged in perfect rows, each indistinguishable. Even dolls and toys were standardized rag figures without faces. Visitors thought it strange, but interpreted it as discipline. But for the children, it was erasure. No possessions, no individuality, no past. Just nameless bodies to be molded. Some researchers believe this explains the ultimate disappearance, that the children had already been vanished in life long before they were gone in flesh. Their names and stories scrubbed, their very existence blurred, so that when 42 of them finally walked out of Henderson into oblivion, the world barely noticed. But there are darker interpretations. In the years after the event, ghost stories blossomed around the building. Locals claimed they heard children calling their names across the fields at dusk, names that were not known in town, whispered as though carried by the wind. Abigail, Henry, Thomas. One farmer's daughter insisted she saw children playing in the orphanage yard long after it was abandoned, but when she called out to them, they did not answer. They only stared, faces indistinct, until she ran home in terror. The most chilling rumor came from the county clerk's office itself. A worker claimed that in 1838, months after the disappearance, a stranger arrived with a heavy ledger under his arm. He presented it as the corrected register of Henderson's orphans. When the clerk opened it, he found every child's name listed not with dates of birth, but with dates of death, all marked October 17, 1837. No graves, no cause of death. Just one final erasure sealed in ink. The ledger was said to have vanished shortly after, and the clerk refused to speak of it again. The children of Henderson were not merely forgotten, they were made into something less than memory. Their identities deliberately dissolved. And perhaps that is the cruelest horror, that when they finally disappeared, they left behind no graves, no headstones, no records, only silence. Morning came slowly on October 18th, 1837. A pale gray mist rolled across the fields, settling thick over the small Ohio town. For the neighbors who lived near Henderson Orphanage, that day began like any other. But by mid-morning, a quiet dread spread through the countryside as the realization took hold the children had not emerged. Not for chores, not for prayers, not for the ritual walk in the yard that usually marked the dawn. The building stood still, its windows dark, its chimneys silent. The first man to step inside was the milkman, James Hewitt. His testimony would later become part of county records. Hewitt knocked on the orphanage door and received no reply. When he pushed, the door creaked open. The air that greeted him was cold, unnaturally so, as though the hearths had not been lit for days. Yet half-eaten bowls of porridge sat on the dining tables, spoons still upright. The food was fresh, abandoned only hours before. Hewitt backed out quickly, unnerved, and ran to alert the sheriff. By noon, dozens of townsfolk gathered outside the building. They entered cautiously, calling out names, but the halls gave back only echoes. The dormitories were immaculate beds made, blankets tucked, shoes aligned in perfect rows. Not one out of place. It was the order that frightened them most. If children had been kidnapped in the night, surely there would have been chaos, resistance, some sign of struggle. Instead, it seemed as though they had vanished mid-routine, leaving everything behind. Sheriff Thomas Alden led the first search. His written notes, preserved in fragments, reveal the confusion: dining hall untouched, food cooling, dormitory empty, no signs of violence. Personal items remain, yet all persons gone. No trace in the yard, nor in the forest paths. He added a line at the bottom, scrawled hastily, "The air feels wrong here." The neighbors split into groups. Some swept through the woods, calling until their voices cracked. Others dragged the riverbanks, searching for bodies. A few searched the barns and outbuildings nearby, but the earth yielded nothing. No broken twigs, no footprints in the mud, no scraps of clothing. Dogs brought to sniff the grounds grew restless, whining and refusing to cross the orphanage's threshold. One farmer reported that when his hound approached the dormitory door, it bolted into the fields and did not return until nightfall. The attic revealed something stranger still. Amid trunks of old uniforms and discarded hymnals lay a set of wax candles melted into a circle. Around them, chalk marks had been drawn onto the floorboards, lines and symbols that none of the townsfolk recognized. One resembled a star twisted into an unfamiliar shape. Another looked like an eye. Some whispered it was the work of the attendants, those two sisters from Cincinnati who had often been seen marking the ground at night. Others thought it was a children's game. But the unease it left was undeniable. Sheriff Alden ordered the symbols scrubbed out before night fell. The chapel was searched next. Pews stood in neat rows, hymnals stacked, Reverend Doer's Bible resting on the pulpit. Yet, when a farmer's wife opened it, she gasped. Pages had been torn from the middle, their edges ragged. The missing section, the book of Matthew, entirely gone. A deliberate act, Alden noted. But for what purpose by sunset? Fear turned to hysteria. Some townspeople shouted that the children had been stolen by travelers, gypsies, or slave raiders. Others whispered that the ground itself had claimed them, that God had smote the orphanage for hidden sins. A few, more pragmatic, wondered if the caretakers had simply fled, selling the children into labor elsewhere. But those who searched the staff's quarters found their clothing still hanging, trunks unopened, beds neatly made. They too had disappeared. The following days deepened the mystery. Search parties combed miles of countryside. Every farmhouse, barn, and hollow tree was inspected. Men dug shallow trenches in fields, expecting to find hurried graves. Nothing. Not a single body, not a shred of fabric. The governor was petitioned for assistance, but state officials dismissed the matter as a local disturbance. Newspapers published only brief mentions, an incident at an Ohio orphan house before dropping the subject entirely. Among the townsfolk, rumors grew poisonous. One farmer claimed he saw a procession of lanterns that final night, children walking calmly into the woods led by a tall figure. Another insisted he heard singing low, rhythmic chanting carried across the fields. A widow swore she saw faces at the window long after the orphanage was empty, pale faces watching her until she fled. Each story contradicted the next, but all agreed something unnatural had taken place. By the end of the week, Henderson Orphanage was abandoned. No one dared to sleep inside its walls. Families avoided the road that passed it, and children whispered that if you pressed your ear against its doors, you could still hear faint voices crying for help. Sheriff Alden closed his investigation with a single grim line. 42 children and their keepers vanished. No remains found, cause unknown. And thus, the morning after left Ohio forever scarred. It was not simply that the children were gone, it was the silence they left behind. A silence so absolute that even the cries of searchers, even the barking of hounds, seemed swallowed by it. And to this day, the question lingers, where did they go? And how could an entire orphanage empty itself without a trace in the aftermath of the disappearance? The first explanations offered were practical ones. Death by natural causes disease, perhaps, or a sudden fire that claimed all 42 children and their caretakers in one night. It was an idea that gave the community a fragile comfort, because at least it suggested an answer. But within weeks, that fragile story began to collapse. There were no graves, no ashes, no smell of burned wood, no evidence of an epidemic. Henderson Orphanage had simply been emptied, without the slightest trace of what became of its inhabitants. The fire theory was the first to be tested. Several townspeople swore that on the night of October 17th, they saw smoke curling above the building. But when Sheriff Alden inspected the grounds, the walls were intact, beams unscorched, hearths cold. The chapel still smelled of incense, not char. If there had been fire, it left behind nothing at all, not a blackened mark, not a single body. One farmer asked a question that chilled his neighbors. If it had burned, wouldn't we at least find bones? Next came whispers of plague. In the 1830s, outbreaks of cholera and typhoid swept through the Midwest. It was easy to imagine that disease had cut down the children overnight, and that the staff, panicked, had buried them in haste. But searches turned up no earth freshly turned, no mounds hidden in the fields, no shallow graves in the nearby woods. Physicians brought in from neighboring counties agreed no signs of epidemic lingered in the building. Bedding was clean. Chamber pots were emptied. Food on the tables untouched by spoil. If illness had struck, it had left behind no scent of death, no stains of vomit or blood, no residue at all. It was this absence that frightened people most. The dead always leave something, one neighbor said bitterly. A grave, a mark, a memory. Here, there is nothing. The townspeople began to mutter that Henderson Orphanage was cursed. In December of that same year, a group of farmers gathered with shovels and lanterns, determined to find proof of burial. They dug through the frozen ground around the building, working until their hands blistered. What they unearthed were not bones, but empty tunnels, passages braced with old timber, leading nowhere. Some speculated that the orphanage had been built over forgotten mine shafts, long abandoned. But others saw it differently. Perhaps these tunnels were dug for concealment, for hiding bodies or conducting rituals out of sight. The mystery of the missing graves deepened when investigators returned to examine the chapel's cellar. It was there that they found the most unsettling clue, a pit dug into the dirt floor, wide and deep, as though prepared to receive many bodies. Yet it was empty, perfectly so. The walls of the pit bore scratch marks, long grooves in the clay as if dug not only with tools but with fingers. And when townsfolk tried to fill the pit in, they swore it refused to stay covered. The soil sagged overnight, sinking inward, as though swallowing itself. Those who believed in natural explanations faltered. Those who believed in something darker found their voices emboldened. Rumors spread of black rites, of sacrifices offered in exchange for prosperity, of children's lives traded for secrets the benefactors wanted hidden. One elderly woman in town, accused of witchcraft years earlier, was dragged from her home and questioned. She insisted she knew nothing of Henderson's fate, but she uttered a chilling phrase: "The graves are not on this earth." The absence of burial sites became more damning with time. Families who had once given their children to Henderson demanded proof of their deaths, some even petitioning for headstones. None were provided. No clergy offered burial rites. The silence of the church was deafening. Reverend Greer, one of the orphanage's original benefactors, quietly left Ohio the following spring. He never returned, and when letters were sent to his new parish in Pennsylvania, none were answered. In the decades that followed, treasure hunters and morbid curiosity seekers descended on the ruins, convinced that graves must still lie hidden. They tore up floorboards, drilled into walls, dug beneath staircases. They found relics, broken toys, rusted lanterns, scraps of hymnals but no remains. Some even claimed that the building resisted them. Shovels snapped, lanterns sputtered, walls groaned. One explorer in 1854 swore he heard children's voices beneath the cellar, calling faintly, "We are still here." He fled before finishing his excavation. The phrase, "graves that never existed," became a local refrain, passed from parent to child in hushed tones. It was a warning, a curse, and a mystery rolled into one. The orphanage had consumed 42 children, and the earth refused to yield their resting place. And so suspicion hardened into legend. Perhaps the children were not buried because they were not dead. Perhaps they were taken into the tunnels, into the woods, or into something far worse that left no trace. To this day, the absence of graves remains the cruelest detail of Henderson Orphanage, proof not of life or death, but of a void where both should be. As the search for bodies yielded nothing, the community turned toward another source of truth records. Surely, somewhere, in county archives or church ledgers, the names of 42 children must be preserved. But the deeper officials dug, the more unsettling the revelations became. It wasn't that the records disproved the children's existence, it was that the records themselves had been altered, erased, or had simply vanished. At first, the sheriff's men consulted the orphanage's own ledgers. They expected to find neat lists of arrivals, baptismal entries, and perhaps notes of adoptions. Instead, the ledger was a chaos of ink and scratches. Entire pages had been torn out. Dates were inconsistent, sometimes moving backward, as if a child's arrival had been written before their supposed birth. Names appeared, only to be crossed out and replaced with new ones in different handwriting. On one page, 6 children were all listed with the same birthday, April 4th, 1830. A clerk later remarked bitterly, It looks less like an orphanage book and more like someone tried to write the lives of children that never were. Worse still, the county courthouse discovered its own archives had been tampered with. Folders labeled Henderson Orphanage. 1830, 1837 were empty. The clerk responsible swore he had filed them only a month prior, yet the papers had vanished. A search of his office uncovered nothing. Another ledger was found in the basement, pages water-damaged and warped, but the entries that remained visible showed only initials J, B, C, H, M, T, no surnames, no details, no traceable lineage. The church records were no better. Reverend Dorr had promised every child at Henderson would be baptized, their names entered into the parish book. But when that book was opened, there were only 12 entries for the orphanage, and even these looked suspicious. The ink was faded, as though older than the building itself. One entry, supposedly from 1835, was written in a hand that scholars later identified as belonging to a priest who had died in 1828. It was as if time itself had been rewritten. The strangeness spread beyond the orphanage. Families who had once placed children there returned to claim proof of their existence. A farmer remembered giving up his son, Thomas, in 1834. Yet, when he demanded documentation, no such boy was listed. His neighbors confirmed they had seen the child with him, and even remembered the day he carried Thomas to Henderson's gates. But on paper, Thomas had never lived. Another woman swore she had delivered twin girls there, only to find their names erased entirely from any registry. "It is as if my daughters were swallowed whole by the ink," she later said. Perhaps most chilling were the corrections made after the disappearance. In early 1838, county officials received a package from an anonymous source. Inside was a bound ledger labeled Henderson Children, corrected. Every child's name was written in perfect calligraphy, accompanied by a single date, October 17, 1837, no births, no adoptions, no notes, just death dates. The officials debated its authenticity, but before they could investigate further, the ledger vanished from storage. When pressed, the clerk responsible could only shake his head. It was there one day, gone the next, and I pray never to see it again. The vanishing records extended even to the benefactors. Elias Henderson's personal correspondence, which should have been preserved among his estate papers, was absent. Reverend Greer's sermons from the orphanage years could not be found. Even census records of the staff grew inconsistent, sometimes listing them as residents of the county, sometimes omitting them entirely. The staff, like the children, seemed to fade from paper as surely as they had faded from the earth. These gaps gave rise to conspiracy. Was someone deliberately erasing Henderson Orphanage from history? If so, who and why? Some claimed it was the benefactors themselves, wielding influence to cover their crimes. Others whispered of government involvement, that the orphanage had been a front for experiments better left unspoken. But many locals preferred a simpler, more terrifying explanation. The records vanished because the children had been taken somewhere that human memory and human ink could not follow. Even today, historians who attempt to research the case find doors closing around them. Documents thought lost reappear briefly, only to crumble in the hands of archivists. Microfilms blur when Henderson's name is scanned. In one instance, a researcher swore that, while scrolling through census reels, the frame containing Henderson Orphanage flickered with static, and the next time she looked, the entry was gone entirely. The story of the Henderson children is not only a story of physical disappearance, but of the erasure of identity itself. It is as if every scrap of their existence has been hunted down, first their bodies, then their names, and finally the very memory of them. And that, perhaps, is the deepest wound not only 42 children without graves, but 42 children without records, without history, a void written into the archives of Ohio, one that no scholar has ever been able to fill. By the winter following the disappearance, the practical explanations had collapsed. No graves, no bodies, no records. The mystery of Henderson Orphanage began to shift into whispers of something far older and darker. For those who lived near the silent building, the unease became unbearable. They spoke not only of strange lights and voices, but of rituals of forbidden practices that had always lingered beneath the orphanage's pious surface. The earliest suspicions centered on Reverend Nathaniel Dorr. His sermons had grown stranger in the months before the vanishing, filled not with scripture but with grim parables of sacrifice. One farmer remembered him preaching that children must walk through fire to be purified. Another recalled him reciting verses in an unfamiliar tongue, his voice low and rhythmic, almost like a chant. After the disappearance, townsfolk combing through his quarters found scraps of parchment stuffed into a locked box. These fragments bore symbols unlike anything from the Bible circles, intersected with jagged lines, spirals that seemed to twist into themselves, and one phrase repeated in crude Latin, corpus est transitus. The body is the passage. The two attendants, the sisters from Cincinnati, were equally suspect. They had been seen many times carving shapes into the earth with sticks, leading children in nighttime games where they stood in circles and hummed monotone notes. Witnesses described them lighting candles not in the chapel but in the fields, arranging them in patterns that matched the chalk markings later found in the attic. Some claimed to hear children repeating words that were not English, as though drilled into them by rote. When asked, the sisters smiled and said it was a new form of prayer. One of the most enduring legends tells of a hidden room beneath the chapel, accessible only through the cellar. Several neighbors insisted they had glimpsed a locked door there, reinforced with iron, which was always kept barred. After the disappearance, when searchers forced it open, they found only a shallow pit. But carved into the stone walls were dozens of handprints small, child-sized hands pressed into the surface as if scorched there. These findings fueled darker speculation. Was Henderson Orphanage not a sanctuary but a stage for ritual? Were the children not raised but prepared? Some argued that the benefactors had established the orphanage for this very purpose, to gather abandoned children, nameless and unclaimed, who could vanish without drawing notice. If so, then the final night of October 17th, 1837 was not a tragedy, but a culmination. In the years that followed, more testimony surfaced. An old woman who had once worked in the orphanage kitchen swore that, on certain nights, she was ordered to stay upstairs while services were conducted in the chapel. She claimed she heard the voices of children singing not hymns, but low, droning chants that left her skin cold. When she crept down once to listen, she saw through a crack in the door a circle of children standing barefoot on the chapel floor, with Reverend Dorr at the center holding a black-bound book. The attendants paced around the circle, carrying bowls of smoke that filled the air with a bitter scent. "It was not of God," she said simply, "and I never went down again." Others spoke of symbols etched into the stained glass windows, visible only when moonlight struck them. The patterns of vines and eyes that had once unsettled visitors now seemed deliberate, arcane rather than decorative. A traveling priest from Cleveland who examined them in 1836 reportedly declared, "These are not Christian symbols. They are wards, or worse, doors." The most chilling rumor emerged decades later, from a man who claimed his grandfather had been part of the original search. He swore that in the attic, beneath the floorboards, his grandfather found not only chalk symbols but bones, tiny bones, animal and human mixed together, bound with twine. Terrified, the searchers buried them secretly, never reporting the discovery, fearing what it meant. What is certain is that the orphanage inspired dread far beyond Ohio. Occult researchers of the late 19th century pointed to Henderson as one of America's earliest examples of ritualistic disappearance. They noted the repeated use of circles, the deliberate erasure of names, the sermons about children walking through fire. To them, Henderson was not an orphanage at all, but a vessel, and the children, 42 of them, were offerings. Of course, skeptics argue these stories are exaggerations, folklore born from trauma. Yet even skeptics struggle to explain the physical evidence: the wax circles, the missing Bible pages, the handprints in stone. These are not things easily dismissed as imagination, and so the whispers endure. That beneath the facade of charity, Henderson Orphanage was a house of ritual. That the children were not lost, but taken led willingly or unwillingly into a ceremony whose purpose remains unspoken. And if that is true, then the question is not where they went, but what they became. When the Henderson Orphanage was finally abandoned, its walls did not fall silent. For decades, those who ventured near claimed the building carried echoes of its lost children, haunting reminders that the 42 had not truly departed. The first reports came within weeks of the disappearance. Farmers traveling past at night swore they heard the faint sound of singing drifting from the empty chapel. Not hymns, not the songs of Sunday service, but something slower, mournful, like a lullaby sung in many voices at once. By the 1840s, the building had already acquired a reputation as cursed ground. No one dared to repurpose it, though officials suggested turning it into a poorhouse. Families avoided the road after sundown. Those who ignored the warnings rarely did so twice. One traveler described stopping to rest near the gate, only to wake in the night to the sound of children's feet pattering across the yard. He opened his eyes and saw dozens of pale figures standing in the grass, staring at him. Their faces were blank, he said, as though carved smooth. Terrified, he fled before dawn, never returning to Ohio. Another account, written in an 1852 journal, tells of a group of teenagers who dared each other to spend the night inside the dormitory. They entered with lanterns and laughter, mocking the town's stories. Yet, by midnight, their mood had turned. One girl swore she heard whispering inside the walls, children reciting names that were not their own. Another boy claimed the blankets on the beds rose and fell as if unseen bodies were breathing beneath them. By morning, the group stumbled out pale and shaken, refusing to describe the full extent of what they saw. The journal records only this chilling line. One of them still wakes screaming with 42 voices in his head. Even animals seemed to sense what lingered there. Horses balked at pulling wagons past the orphanage, their eyes rolling white. Dogs refused to cross its threshold. Birds did not roost on its roof. Locals began to say that the ground itself was hollow with cries, that if you pressed your ear to the soil, you could hear children calling from beneath. The legends multiplied. Some swore that if you stood at the chapel door on October 17th, the anniversary of the vanishing, you could hear the entire building come alive, footsteps racing in the halls, laughter echoing in the dormitories, hymns sung in ghostly chorus. Others told of seeing candlelight flicker in the upper windows. Though the glass had long since shattered, a few brave souls who entered claimed to feel tiny hands tugging at their clothing, cold breaths at their necks, or the unmistakable sensation of being counted each step they took, followed by whispers, 1, 2, 3. In 1869, the orphanage finally collapsed in a storm. Lightning struck the spire, splitting the chapel roof and sending fire through the beams. But even in ruin, the hauntings continued. Travelers passing the charred remains reported hearing children crying in the rain. A soldier, returning from the Civil War, swore that, as he camped near the ruins, he woke to find his boots neatly lined up outside his tent, just as the children's shoes had once been arranged. The paranormal accounts grew so persistent that Henderson became a site of grim pilgrimage. Spiritualists of the late 19th century, eager to prove communication with the dead, flocked to the ruins. They held seances amid the rubble, placing their hands upon the scorched bricks. Many reported sudden cold gusts and the sound of weeping. One medium fainted mid-ritual, later claiming she saw 42 small figures standing in a circle, bound hand to hand, with a tall shadow at their center. Even into the 20th century, hikers and campers spoke of strange encounters. A man in 1921 described hearing a child call his name in the woods near the ruins, though he had never been there before, and no one in his family had ties to the orphanage. When he turned, no one stood behind him. In 1957, 2 boys exploring the area claimed to find a rag doll in the rubble. Its face was blank, stitched with no features. They brought it home, only to wake the next night to the sound of dozens of children laughing in their bedroom. They buried the doll in panic, but the laughter, they said, did not stop for 3 more nights, whether one believes in spirits or not. The Henderson Orphanage haunts Ohio in more ways than one. Its ruins became a reminder not only of 42 missing children, but of the way tragedy leaves echoes that refuse to fade. To this day, locals say that if you drive the back roads near the site on a foggy evening, you may glimpse small figures at the tree line, watching. And if you dare to listen closely, you may hear the faintest sound children singing in unison, a hymn that no one living can remember. By the time the 20th century rolled forward, the ruins of Henderson Orphanage had nearly vanished into the soil. But the story never left. It lingered like a scar across Ohio's collective memory, a wound people refused to touch, yet one that throbbed with every whisper, every echo of the past. The official explanation remained silence. Newspapers dropped the subject. State officials dismissed it as local folklore. But among families who had lost children, among neighbors who remembered the morning of October 18th, 1837, silence felt deliberate. It was not ignorance, it was suppression. For many, the orphanage became a story that Ohio desperately tried to forget. The unanswered questions were too heavy, too unsettling. How could an entire orphanage of children and staff vanish in one night, leaving no graves, no records, no trace? How could the earth itself yield no evidence? When history always leaves a mark for the county, for the state, the only solution was to close the door, to bury the story deeper than any grave. Yet the questions refused to stay buried. Generations of researchers returned to the case, each finding only fragments. Some concluded that Henderson had been a front for human trafficking, that the caretakers sold the children into hidden markets, erasing records to cover their tracks. Others argued that disease had claimed them, and officials orchestrated a cover-up to avoid panic. But none of these theories explain the absence of remains, the vanishing ledgers, the eerie handprints in the stone beneath the chapel. There were other theories, stranger and darker. Occult scholars pointed to the repeated use of circles, the sermons about sacrifice, the erased names, and the idea that the children had been prepared for something beyond ordinary comprehension. Perhaps Henderson was not an orphanage at all, but a ritual machine, a vessel designed to strip away names, histories, and identities until the children were empty, ready to be led into whatever ceremony claimed them. If that was true, then the night of October 17th was not an accident. It was fulfillment. Modern paranormal investigators still make pilgrimages to the site, though little remains but broken stone and twisted roots. Many return with recordings of faint cries, of footsteps in the dirt where no one walked, of children's voices repeating numbers in the dark. Skeptics scoff, dismissing it as wind, imagination, or the power of suggestion. But believers argue that the voices are proof that the children never left, that they linger still, trapped in the place where their names were erased and their bodies swallowed. And so, the Henderson Orphanage remains a secret Ohio tried to erase. A story almost too dark to acknowledge, too cruel to repeat, yet too haunting to forget. It is more than a local mystery. It is a reminder of how fragile history can be. When lives are erased from paper, from memory, from Earth itself, what remains? Only whispers, only shadows, only a story retold in hushed voices, hoping to keep alive what was stolen away. Even now, one cannot stand at the sight without feeling it, that oppressive silence, heavy and unnatural, as though 42 pairs of eyes are still watching from behind the trees. The graves were never found. The names were never restored. The truth was never written, and perhaps that is the greatest horror of all, that Henderson Orphanage and the children who vanished within its walls were not lost to time, but deliberately hidden. And so we are left with the question that can never be resolved. What truly happened on that October night in 1837 when 42 children walked into silence and never returned? Was it man's cruelty, or something older, darker, that demanded them? The earth will not say, the records will not say, the voices in the night only whisper fragments, for the silence of Henderson Orphanage endures. History is a tapestry woven of names, dates, and places, but sometimes entire threads are pulled away, leaving only gaps where lives once were. Henderson Orphanage is one of those gaps, a story not recorded in textbooks, not etched in stone, but passed down like a curse. 42 children vanished without graves, without records, without explanation. And what remains is not closure, but a lingering wound. Some say it was human greed, the staff selling children into shadows. Others believe it was ritual, that the orphanage was never meant to shelter, but to harvest. And still, others insist it was something stranger, that the land itself, the walls themselves, demanded payment. The truth has been buried so deeply that perhaps it will never be unearthed. But legends endure because they demand to be remembered. Every whisper of children's cries in the night, every flicker of candlelight in the ruins, every chill felt by those who pass the site keeps the memory alive. The story survives because it refuses to fade, because forgetting would mean those children truly died a second death. And so, that I leave you with the question, what do you believe really happened at Henderson Orphanage? Were the children lost to human cruelty or something far darker? Comment your thoughts below. Subscribe for more stories history tried to erase, and continue watching this video here.